Thank you for having me here. I want to, I'm going to basically talk about my book a little bit, but also the importance of oral history and preserving history, which is kind of what Darren alluded to a little bit about the importance of that. But first, I'm going to acknowledge that, why is there a white man standing up here at the Black History Symposium talking about Black history? And I approached the writing of this book from a preservationist standpoint. I didn't want to become a storyteller, I wanted to become a story preservationist, someone that helped keep history alive, because it's all of our history that's, whether we were the oppressor or the oppressed, whether we were the settler or the indigenous community, it's all now melded together into this one big story, and we need to acknowledge all parts of that story. So when I went about this, I sat down with people like Dorothy and Jerry Binga and Murray Scott, who I spoke to on the phone about this book, and I just listened. I turned on my tape recorder and I sat back, and I remember Dorothy saying, I don't think I have anything to say about sports, and 2.5 hours later, we had finished. And so it was, and then we had more conversations and more. So it's not necessarily about sports, this book. It's about the lens of our community and the history of not only Black settlement, but Japanese, Canadian, and Indigenous communities here as well, through the lens of sport. And for me, I grew up on the other side of that, where I was raised, steeped in racism. To be racist, to be someone that held stereotypes, and I think that a portion of this book that I wanted to come to light was that through education, we can change those ideologies. Because this book not only talks about racism, which is a major portion of it through sport, but it also talks about celebrations of different groups in our communities. The Green Valley baseball team that's in here really wasn't too well defined. We've all heard about the Chatham Colored All-Stars. Miriam and Heidi Jacobs have done a wonderful job documenting that. But we didn't really talk about how the first ever organized baseball game in Chatham, Kent was played by an all-black team in 1871, 50 years before the Chatham Colored All-Stars. So it's part of history here where sport played a major role in our community. And I'm going to start by reading just an intro to a chapter about Fergie Jenkins, because that's a very prominent name, of course, in this community. But Fergie only plays one chapter in this book. As much as he's in here, people like the all-women's baseball team of the Maple City Jets and the Taylorettes are also preserved here, where lesser parts of our known history, I hope, have had some light shone on them. So I'll read just a tiny bit from the first chapter here, because I like to set myself and our community so we know where we're coming from. So this is the intro to a chapter called Pray for Fergie. For years, I would follow the same truck on my way to work. The driver and I likely woke at the same time, checked the same weather reports. Maybe we sat down at similar tables and drank our coffee, and then stood to gather our coats and shoes. The darkest hours seemed to be those just prior to sunrise, my turn signal illuminating the world in intervals. As I pulled onto the highway, the man in his truck would pull out ahead of me, like clockwork. I could see his eyes in the glow of my headlights on his rearview mirror. There in the darkness on the road in front of me, he'd accelerate. My beams would strike the tailgate of his truck and bring to life the Confederate flag painted there. Each morning I wondered about that man. We were in Canada, after all. This flag had no geographic origin here, but it did have meaning. Eventually, the driver of that truck would pass a sign reading, "Welcome to Chatham, home of Fergie Jenkins." So I like to read that because I think it shows both sides of our community. One that's steeped in rich Black history that we celebrate, and one that is also has a deep history of resistance to Black settlement, to Indigenous settlement, to Japanese Canadian settlement as well. And the second one I read is similar, and it's about sundown towns, because if you didn't know, Chatham, Kent was home to multiple sundown towns, Blenheim, Walsburg, if you go just outside of our borders to Leamington, But this one's about Wallaceburg, which is where I'm from. And there was no black family that lived in Wallaceburg until the early 1960s. And that was because the town was a sundown town. So this is from chapter 13, Sundown Town. In Wallaceburg, excuse me, sunset can be a beautiful time, especially along the Sydenham River. A town of roughly 10,000 people, Wallaceburg was built on manufacturing. The famous Louisville Slugger baseball bats and Louisville hockey sticks were both made here. Hall of Famers like Mark Messier, Steve Eichmann, and Brett Hall would all visit to test their new sticks. Wallaceburg is connected by the waterways to the Great Lakes, and on summer days the brown water slowly meanders through town and long shadows creep out from poplar trees. The quiet interrupted only by the sound of car tires rumbling across the 4 main bridges. Light shimmers on the wake of small boats driven by town teenagers, and kids sneak onto the old train bridge to drink cheap beer and swim in the turbid water. There's almost certainly a father and son standing behind the local library fishing from the boardwalk. In the center of town is the walking bridge, where pedestrians can wave at boaters, and teens can steal a kiss in the fading light, and where a black taxi cab driver was threatened with lynching if he dared stay overnight in the town. So that story, and how a sundown town was born, was actually started through baseball. So in the 1800s, Wallaceburg and Dresden would often play baseball games against each other, and they would always end in a fight. Fans, players, both towns would fight each other. Just seemed to be the after-game festivities. And Wallaceburg, being the bigger town, would have more people, and they would generally win those fights. So Dresden started bringing men that were wrestlers or boxers from the Don settlement with them, and then Dresden started winning those fights. And soon, Wallaceburg recruited dock workers and shipbuilders and people that worked, hard labor, tough jobs. And soon the rule became that if you were entering the town as a black person, you would need to fight one of those tough and tumble people to enter the community. And the sundown town was born, all through a baseball battle. And so sport has played a role in so many different aspects of our community. But it's also been a wonderful thing. If you think about the Chatham Colored All-Stars, how that story has spread across Canada and is helping to educate people. We can go back to the Buxton Bloomers, an all-women's baseball team that played in pastures in Buxton, and how that was such a community-building aspect. Or Dolores Shad, who coached teams of Chinese Americans and Mexican Americans in Detroit. So it's a story of building all this, but for me, preserving these stories was so important. The oral history was fascinating, because I grew up listening to my own grandparents sit at a round table like you're all at, and we would sit there and I would listen to their stories for hours on end, and I knew every nuance. I knew exactly when they were going to shift roles, and my grandmother would lead into my grandfather's lines in the same story, and I knew how they would say those lines and when they would giggle, and when my grandmother would punch my grandpa for saying the same thing that I'd heard him say 1,000,000 times over. And then when they passed away, I started forgetting those things. I started forgetting exactly how the story was told and which line was whose. And all of those things were gone pretty soon. And it didn't matter how many times I tried to write them down, I couldn't hear them say it anymore. So when I sat down with Dorothy, my grandmother was the exact same height as Dorothy, and I felt like I was going to put my shoulder on Dorothy and rest it there. And listening to her, I found myself at one point, I remember I wrote in the book, that when Dorothy was talking, I swept the table in front of me. And I thought about why I did that, and it felt like I was sweeping the crumbs off my grandmother's table that she couldn't see anymore, because Dorothy had brought me to that exact spot. And the importance of her story coming into this and being kind of that connection between my family and this new wonderful family that I've now connected with was so powerful that I wanted to have those recordings forever. And I wanted to have the stories of everyone that wanted to tell one. Jerry Vinga's story, you know, being in here and his connections and his, as much about his, you know, his mom and his family as it is about the fact that Jerry was a fantastic hockey player and swimmer. And the first black captain of the Blenheim Blades hockey team. And something that I only found out by looking at a photo from a hockey team in the I think it was the late 60s, early 70s, and I saw 2 Japanese Canadian men and 2 black men on a hockey team back then, and I thought, well, this is incredible, because we talk about hockey as this predominantly white sport, and here we are 50-something years ago, and I had no idea who any of those men were. It turned out that one of the Japanese Canadian men, Pat Cosby, was about 3 doors down from me, and turned out that Jerry and I had the same several-hour conversations multiple times afterwards, and the stories now are here, and when someone else looks at that picture, they'll be able to know. And so that oral history, and all of us taking part in protecting that history and preserving it, not necessarily people taking over anyone else's story to tell it, which is why anytime I've had an event that I could, you know, I've invited people that are in the book to be there so that I can point at Jerry and I can point at Dorothy and say, this is their story. All I did was keep it there. And I hope that other people take that idea and keep those oral histories alive, because as much as the date of the 1934 Colored All-Stars is impactful, if you sit there and listen to you know, Blake Harding talk about Boomer, you feel the history, and it's there, it's alive, more in depth. And when you hear Dorothy talk about the horrifying histories of the A.J. Tansers of the world, it's not just a name on a street sign in Chatham anymore. It's something real, and it's something that's impactful to us all, and that's how we educate people. Not about giving dates and facts, but about listening to other people and sitting down and learning that at this moment, which is usually how I end my speeches about this, is that the best thing that a lot of us can do as allies and people is to close our mouths and listen to others. And so for the rest of the day, I'm now going to close my mouth and listen to others. So thank you.